Now I want to talk about how this debate over gender is playing itself out in education. And essentially, a subtitle for this section could be, what are my kids learning in sex ed? So we are going to get in, and we're going to highlight now also much of what's being taught specifically in the curriculum in public schools. Now, thinking about gender. This is how most of us have always thought about gender. We think about gender and sex as interchangeable, different words to refer to the same thing, what your anatomy is, what your chromosomes are, who you are as a person. You're either a boy, you're either a girl, blue for boys, pink for girls. We have different bathroom symbols. We understand there's two categories and we've all moved on. For most of us, for most of our life, it hasn't been any more complicated than that. And for most of the planet, it still isn't any more complicated than that. And we're scratching our heads wondering, what is all the fuss about? But we're going to try to help you understand how the kind of the hard left progressive world is thinking about this concept of gender. Not because we think it's necessarily true, but it's helpful to understand where they're coming from so we know exactly how to form an argument and kind of have a response and understand exactly what all the confusion is. And so one of the tools that is being used to describe gender in this new way, as they would like the world to think about it, is this lovely gender unicorn. And this gender unicorn kind of illustrates the 5 compartments of the person as they would like you to think. And as you see here, start in the middle of this diagram. The first is the sex assigned at birth. And this is what we always think of as gender and sex. Now, the left does not deny that there is such thing as a sex assigned at birth. They don't deny that people have anatomy, that people have biology, and that there are chromosomes and DNA that have something to say about the way our bodies function. So they don't deny that, they just minimize the significance of it. And the term that they would use to refer to that is merely the sex assigned at birth. But what they think is much more important, when you go to the top of this chart, is gender identity. And as you see, reflected by the rainbow coming out of the unicorn's brain, your gender identity exists entirely and exclusively inside of your brain. And you would be the only one who knows what your gender identity is. And it is determined entirely, exclusively, solely based on how you're feeling, how you view yourself. And, by the by, they will tell you, is totally distinct from your sex assigned at birth. It might be the same as your sex assigned at birth, it might be different, but your gender identity is something that only you can possibly know. Now, distinct from your gender identity, move down the chart a little bit, is your gender expression. And this is basically how you choose to express, how you choose to live out what your gender identity is. And from their perspective, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do that. And so you have, very masculine, the very feminine, to, non. And they, the category of others or genderless or non-conforming. There's many different terms that refer to some aspect of your gender expression as well. And then in addition to that, the other things that we're not going to focus on for these purposes, but the gender unicorn also talks about who you're physically attracted to or emotionally attracted to, which would kind of fall under the umbrella of sexual orientation. Now, how is this being played out in public schools? And we're going to spend some time focusing, though there's much we're going to miss, but we're going to focus on how this is being presented in the FLASH curriculum. And FLASH curriculum, it stands for Family Life and Sexual Health Curriculum. It was pioneered in King County in Washington State, but we now know that it is being pushed in many other parts of the state. Other school districts outside of King County are adopting this, and so we kind of want to build some familiarity, not because it's the only curriculum, but it's a popular one in Washington State, and it's a good representation of how this topic is being presented to people. And so we see that the FLASH curriculum, as early as kindergarten, we already talked about that, begins asking, in the K through 4 curriculum, they're asking children, if you could be born again and pick your gender, you would stay the same or change to the other gender. Which is a very interesting thing to be planting in the minds of kindergartners or first grade students, because they're not intuitively thinking about this. But of course, by asking the question that nobody is instinctively asking, you're planting this idea in impressionable little minds that, yeah, you can change your gender. You don't have to be the gender that you think you are or that somebody told you that you are. So we're seeing this rolled out in education curriculum at a very, very young age. Now, let's talk a little bit about how the left is viewing gender. And the diagram you see here is part of what the gender spectrum, and the left and the progressive world talks about gender as being a spectrum, as distinct from the male-female categories that we all understand gender and sex to be. They would like you to view them as a spectrum, where you have, in the same way that you have, instead of seeing it as two binary categories, and in the binary is kind of the phrase that they're at war with, the idea that there's a box and you have to pick one. Down with the binary, you'll hear them chant, or have seen it on t-shirts. Instead of seeing it as two options that you must pick one, they would like the world to see gender as essentially like your faucet at home. You have a faucet, you have hot water, you have cold water, and then you have a whole bunch of temperatures in between. And that's kind of, there's like spectrums of androgyny, or that is how they would like you to view gender, where there's 100% masculine, 100% female, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff maybe in the middle of that. That's how gender was being presented for a long time, and that's where the concept that gender is a spectrum came from. But even that is being changed already by the left. And the image you see here, I refer to it as the gender blob. It provides a little more context to the gender spectrum, because you have there these points, and anybody who's into math or science, frankly, if you dealt with much data, you'll kind of recognize what's going on here. Is at X we have very masculine, at Y we would have very feminine, and then at Z we would have very androgynous. And then presumably some point in that middle it'd be like genderless, which curiously the state of Oregon is now allowing people to identify as genderless, which of course is not possible, scientifically speaking, but since when does that matter? But how they would view this gender blob, and you have all these varying points, is what they believe about gender is that you could pick any dot on this map. So somewhere between the X and the Z, close to the middle, or somewhere between the X and the Y on the very edges, any data point on that blob they would classify as a distinct gender, which is why they will say there's an infinite number of genders. And I've had arguments and discussions with people lately who say everybody is transgender, and what they mean by that is no one is 100% masculine and no one is 100% feminine. So everyone is somewhere on this spectrum of masculinity, femininity, androgyny. Everyone is different. There are an infinite number of genders. Now, this next image is going to, I want to just describe, they have gone to the work of, this is 32 of the genders that have been very specifically identified, and a term has been given to them. Now, I have no idea what any of them mean other than the male and female, which are the top left part of this graph. I think we all understand what that means and what that is, but we have terms like bigender, androgyne, neutrois, agender, genderless, intergender, demi-boy, demi-girl. Do I know what these mean? No. I'm not going to try to explain to you what each of these are, because I don't know even the people who created these, if they can actually tell you what they are exactly. But this is just kind of an illustration of the terms that are coming, that are being created to try to describe something about gender. And if you read some of the kind of literature around gender identity and gender expression, what you'll see, and kind of the exercise that many are going through, is if they don't find something that they feel perfectly describes them, then they will essentially create their own definition and their own term to describe what they would view as a new gender that perfectly describes them. Because again, from their perspective, there are an infinite number of genders. A term that's helpful to, I think, keep in mind as we think about how this is being discussed is performative. And this is the idea that gender is not something that you are, it's something that you do. Now, I'm not sure it's accurate. In fact, I don't think it's accurate, but this is how they want the world to view gender. And we've always thought of, your gender is something that you're born. You have certain parts when you're born, you have certain anatomy, and that determines you are a boy, you are a girl. And they reject the idea that you are, or that you are something. It's something that you do and you perform based on really how you're feeling and what's going on in your mind. Now, are you confused yet about any of this? And I think it's probably likely that you are, because when you meet the gender blob and you start reading some of the gender definitions, and keep in mind those 32 that we referred to are just the tip of the iceberg. The state of New York specifically protects 200 different genders. Facebook will allow you to choose from 56 different gender options. So this is a deep, deep, deep well that we can dig into. But if you're confused by any of this, I got some clarity in a conversation with a radical feminist friend of mine when we were discussing this, who helped illuminate some of the confusion around this. What they mean by the term gender, we have always understood as meaning personality. So if you substitute, in all of their language, everything you read, every time you hear their conversation, all of this strangeness about all the different ways that they're using gender is not something that you are, it's something that you do. There's an infinite number of genders. Gender is a spectrum. If you substitute their use of the word gender with the word personality, then suddenly it all makes sense. And magically, it's actually not even that controversial at that point. Because yes, everybody does agree that that people are different. You can be, have the exact same DNA as your twin and be a very different person. Not all men are the same as other men. Not all women are the same as other women. So this is where we have a lot of common ground. It's just, why are we deciding that we need to change the common understanding of the word gender in order to create all this confusion, to communicate something that everybody understood in the first place? People are different. We all agree on that. Why then do we need to contort the word gender to make that point? And that's where we want to get to next, is why complicate gender? Because there actually is an answer to that, and there is an answer that comes out of the curriculum that they are using to promote this stuff. And again, we're going to go back into the Flash curriculum, and I want to apologize because I'm going to do something, I'm going to make you read more than I typically would in a presentation like this, but I think it's important to show the content of the information from the Flash curriculum exactly as it is presented in the curriculum itself. So we're going to read through some of this, but I think it's going to help you understand why this is. And so why are we complicating gender? Why can't we all just agree that personality is the better term instead of the way they're using gender? Now, as we go into the Flash curriculum, again, we're looking at the high school Flash curriculum here, and you'll see here on this slide, this is the document that introduces the Flash curriculum, and it talks about the rationale for what the curriculum is trying to do. And at the very top, first paragraph there, it says, the prevention of sexual violence is both a behavioral goal of Flash in its own right and an important strategy for preventing teen pregnancy and STDs. So we want to prevent sexual violence, and that's a goal of Flash now. No disagreement there. Everybody recognizes that sexual violence should not occur. We'd all like to make it stop. But then let's roll down to the bottom of that same page after it's talking about sexual violence as the problem we're trying to solve. How are they trying to solve it? And it says there, undoing gender stereotypes is the foundation for Flash's sexual violence prevention. Undoing gender stereotypes is the foundation for Flash's sexual violence prevention. Before you watched any of this, if we'd sat down and had a conversation and we said, hey, there's this problem of sexual violence that we need to solve. What do you think are the causes and what can we do to fix it? I think it would take us a long time before any of us got to, oh, I know, we need to get rid of gender stereotypes. Because really, it's gender stereotypes that are causing all the sexual violence in the world. That is not intuitive at all, yet it is the assumption for what the Flash curriculum is attempting to do. Now, when we understand the gender stereotypes that they're referring to, we might get a little clarity, not necessarily in agreement that they actually have identified the real root of the problem, but we'll begin to get a little more clarity about where they're coming from. Because the same curriculum then lists the traditional expectations of men and women. You'll see on this next slide, there on your right, you see exactly how it's written in the curriculum, but we've highlighted some of these things. But essentially, it describes the traditional expectations, the gender stereotypes that they believe are at the root of sexual violence. And here's the gender stereotypes that they are at war with. The idea that women are submissive, weak, hormonal, moody, jealous, clingy, and dramatic. That's what they think the traditional expectations of women are. And the traditional expectations of men, they are to be tough, not to show weakness, in charge, sexually in control. So Their assumption is this is what the boys and girls in their classroom are being told it means to be male or female. And to the extent that their students embrace these traditional, in their mind, quote unquote, traditional concepts of gender, then that will lead to sexual violence. Now, I think there's a couple problems with this. And when I showed this to one person to get their reaction, one lady, and her response was, well, I think somebody is projecting their abusive childhood on the rest of the world. And honestly, I think that might be a pretty accurate assessment of what's happening here, because I don't know anyone. Now there's 7 billion people on the planet, and there are many who are very different than I am and have different environments. And I think that to some degree that there are elements of these stereotypes that have been unhelpful, that are certainly unhealthy, that may have been communicated by a handful of people, probably erroneously. But I literally don't know anyone in my life ever who would see these descriptions of men and women and say, yeah, that's how I want my daughters to grow up. Yeah, that's how I want my sons to grow up. I don't know anyone like that. And so this really is a straw man argument that's being propped up as the foundation of this entire curriculum. And we're telling these students, okay, here's the traditional expectations of men and women, which I don't actually think is true, but they're saying these are the traditional expectations. So your choices are to recognize that there's an infinite number of genders, or to just embrace this culture which leads to sexual violence. Because you can see how, I mean, if this is the way that people actually viewed themselves, yeah, that could lead to sexual violence. But I don't know anybody who actually thinks this is how I'm supposed to be as a man or a woman, and certainly this is how I'm going to tell my children to behave. There are elements of some problems that we need to deal with, but as a general description, I think it's highly inaccurate based on most people's experience. But let's see how this rolls itself out. Once they've propped up these straw man descriptions of gender expectations, then we begin to have these conversations. And I want to read through this because this is exactly as it's presented in the curriculum in the teacher's manual in the Flash curriculum. So they'll pose to the class this question, a question like this. And this is the first example. It says, on Saturday night, Alicia had sex with her girlfriend, even though she wasn't in the mood because she didn't want to hurt her girlfriend's feelings. All right? That's our fact pattern. The first question, which traditional expectation of women is likely influencing Alicia's actions? Well, that she's to be passive or weak. How might Alicia feel in this situation? Well, she might feel bad or ashamed that she had sex even though she didn't want to. Confused, angry, and sad, like she can't talk to her girlfriend. Well, third question. What problems could this expectation cause for Alicia? She could end up doing things she doesn't feel good about. She could have problems with her girlfriend. Finally, what advice would you give to Alicia to challenge this gender expectation? And the advice that's recommended, don't have sex if you don't want to. Share what you do or do not want to do with your girlfriend. And that's the class conversation that the teacher is instructed to have about Alicia's challenges. Now, there's another one that I want to get into before we address these at a much higher level, and this has to do with Cooper. Cooper tells his girlfriend that he wants to have sex tonight, but he doesn't ask her what she wants. That's our fact pattern. Now, what are the questions that we're going to have around this? First, which traditional expectations of men is likely influencing Cooper's actions? Well, that he's to be sexually in control. What problems could this expectation cause for Cooper? Now, his girlfriend might break up with him. He could commit rape. What advice would you give to Cooper to challenge this gender expectation? Well, ask her if she wants to have sex, and only have sex if his girlfriend also wants to. Now, as parents, grandparents, friends of Alicia and Cooper, if these are actually people in your lives, in the legal world, we refer to this exercise as issue spotting. We'll see a fact pattern, and then we will identify the issues that arise that need to be addressed as a result of the facts that are presented to us. Now, if you and I were to sit down with Alicia and Cooper, understanding what little we know about their lives based on the information presented here, it's likely that there are a host of issues that come up for us long before we get to gender expectations. Cooper, Alicia, why are you sexually involved at all with anybody? You're in high school. This is really bad for you. Let's talk about all of the things that that can happen to you. And the students intuitively know this because students will look at this fact pattern and they'll realize, yeah, there's maybe some problems here. But the exercise that the teacher is instructed to do will take the students immediately and brush past all of the immediate, much larger issues and concerns that they can spot for Cooper and Alicia, and point out the fact that the only thing that Cooper and Alicia could possibly be doing wrong is not communicating effectively with their partner about their sex life. And once they reject the gender expectations that are leading to their failures to communicate, then all will be well. And then Cooper and Alicia can do whatever they want with whomever they want, and as long as everybody's consenting, this is going to be beautiful and wonderful, and they're going to be happy and healthy, which is, of course, a big giant lie. And so the challenge is here. Cooper and Alicia's problems, they have so many big problems long before we get to gender expectations that the class is all being instructed to ignore, and that the teacher is being instructed to ignore. But what is being communicated by ignoring the much bigger issues in this classroom conversation is really significant, because we're telling the students the only thing you can do wrong is not communicate well. And then, of course, as soon as we get done having these conversations with Cooper and Alicia, and telling the class, or suggesting to the teacher that they show the video LGBTQ discrimination, and they give you the website where you can go pick up that video, and you can imagine exactly what that video contains. Now, at the end of the sex ed curriculum, there's a resource center that highlights, because we've also had, in addition to this gender conversation, we've had this conversation about contraception, and it points out to the students, again, this is high school curriculum, says, it's confidential, in big bolded words up there. Teens of any age can get all the services listed on this handout confidentially in Washington State. Confidential services include birth control, condoms, emergency contraception, pregnancy tests, STD, HIV tests, prenatal care, abortion, and adoption. So not only is it true that in Washington State, parental notification is not required for any of these things, rest assured that your school is advertising that fact to your students as quickly as possible. Now, we all know that when we were in high school, one of our great deterrents to doing stupid things was the fear that our parents might discover what we were doing and punish us for them. But your schools and the teachers in your schools are reinforcing to your students that they can do all of these things, and there's no risk that you, the parents, you, the grandparent, are ever going to know about these things. This is the vital service that the public education system is providing to parents today. And notice the resources that they're directing the students to. The phone number for Planned Parenthood of the Great Northwest, as well as down there, phone numbers for the Cedar River Clinic at the bottom of the page. That is a late-term abortion clinic here in Washington State as well, which, by the way, is a provider of aborted fetal tissue to the Birth Defects Research Lab at the University of Washington. Now, this conversation in the flash curriculum that you should be concerned about doesn't just have to do with gender. And I want to flash a little warning up here. If you're watching this with your kids, you might want to pause this, fast forward a little bit, find out if you want your young, impressionable minds to read this, because this is stuff I didn't know about that I wouldn't want my 12 and under children reading. So you can make that decision for yourself, but we do want to have a little warning here and let you know that there is some content that will be objectionable to some members of our audience for sure. But that being said, this is what exists in the 7th and 8th grade curriculum. Now keep in mind, we just went through some of what was going on in high school. This is the 7th and 8th grade curriculum here in Washington State. And they're going to talk about, and this is verbatim from the curriculum, we're going to introduce the 7 methods of birth control, focusing on what each is and how it reduces pregnancy risks. And now, reiterating a point that was made earlier, the question posed to the class: which methods can teachers get without parental consent? Well, the answer: all of these. Which is not to imply that it is ideal, although we realize that in an ideal world, every child could share this coming-of-age decision with his or her family. The law recognizes that some families can't or don't talk about sexual issues, and the most important thing is helping people prevent unintended pregnancies. So again, we have another advertisement, this time to 7th and 8th graders, letting your middle school child know that every form of birth control they could possibly want is available to them without your knowledge. You're welcome. But in addition, we're also going to introduce some other concepts to our 7th and 8th graders. This is something that I had no idea. I'm 38 years old. I did not know what a dental dam was, and I don't think my life was any worse for not knowing what a dental dam was. But now, your 7th and 8th graders are going to know what a dental dam is, and they are going to, in the explanation of dental dams, they're going to introduce them to concepts that almost certainly they hadn't thought about on their own. But you're welcome. 7th and 8th graders, here's some things that you can know about. In addition to that, we're going to have a conversation about anal intercourse, and of course we're going to describe what that is, and of course it is a thing, but in addition to a graphic explanation of it, I think that the instructions for teachers that are included in this discussion are really, really insightful. And what it says here, instructions for the teachers, it says, probably some students in your class will make inappropriate noises and comments at the idea of anal intercourse. Well, this is 7th and 8th graders. Of course they're going to make inappropriate comments. But here's the instructions to the teachers. It is important not to allow disrespectful remarks. Because people have diverse beliefs about intercourse, this would be an appropriate time to use the values question protocol. Now, let's put this in context of the larger conversation, because you remember, we just had a conversation about Alicia and Cooper and their sex lives and their relationships with their boyfriend and girlfriend in high school. And remember, we didn't do anything. We didn't judge Alicia and Cooper's decisions. We didn't in any way suggest that maybe it would be better for them to exercise self-control, that it would be better for them emotionally and physically if they didn't take those risks, if they didn't put themselves out in a way to get hurt emotionally and be exposed to all sorts of STDs that are floating around the world among the promiscuous. We didn't talk about any of that. We just said the only thing possibly that Alicia and Cooper could do wrong is not communicate effectively about their sex lives. And we are certainly going to have no judgment about that. The only time this curriculum starts inserting its judgment is at the prospect, and of course the certainty, that there are students in the class who are going to snicker about the idea of anal intercourse because it's really uncomfortable, and these are 7th and 8th graders, and that's what they do. But again, the value statement that the school is bringing in is that we're not going to judge this. Of course, it's really, really bad for you. Of course, it's, your body's not made to do that, and of course, it could lead to all sorts of negative physical consequences for you if you engage in this activity. But we're not going to mention any of that. We're just going to make, the only judgment that we are going to bring to this conversation is judgment of any student who would in any way suggest that anal intercourse is not something that's perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, perfectly virtuous for 7th and 8th graders to be engaging in. That is the context in which all of this is being brought to students through our sex ed curriculum.